This is Beyond the Resume, the podcast that brings you the stories, advice, and insights behind some of the most successful people in real estate. Beyond the Resume is brought to you by Jackson Lucas Executive Search, the industry leader in human capital solutions. Here is Chris Papa and Lisa Flicker.
All right, Gunnar Branson, welcome to the podcast. I think you have the best name so far. We've been doing this 5 years. You have the best name, Gunnar Branson.
I had
You're
nothing
going
to
to
do
get
with
an
it.
award at the end.
Oh, there you go, for best name. I like that.
Gunnar Branson. What's the worst name, Lisa? Don't say it. She knows.
Can't
She's
say it. Don't worry, it's not Chris Papa.
Good.
Fair enough.
Gunnar, how are you? You look great. Did you say you were a off-Broadway actor?
Off Broadway, back in the very late 80s, early 90s, and closed down after a couple of months, but did have some experience there.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
it's
such a
fun.
good. My son's a big actor. He's 14. He does high school plays and community theater, and it's such a good experience to like get in front of people and get over yourself. Basically,
There is that. There is also the kind of economic reality of it, which is a little wearing, as is kind of the way it messes with your, sense of self. But other than that, it's awesome.
Well, I think I first met Gunnar at a ULI and a national council meeting for the Global Exchange Council. And at the end of the meeting, they broke us up into small groups, and we had to do some kind of a small project. And I was just blown away. We had chosen Gunnar as our speaker, and I mean, he's been training for a long time to be on Beyond the Resume. So he's earned his spot here for sure.
Finally, my goal has been accomplished. Here I am.
Let's open up the resume and go beyond it. Let's talk about your background. You've been involved with different organizations. You're a board member. How do you like being a board member at AHC?
It's great. I mean, it's an outstanding organization that really is trying to do something about affordable housing, has been for decades. And the challenges are everything from, the very basic in terms of how you take care of people that are really, in some ways, the most vulnerable, to how do you create new housing and how do you create more supply. But Paul Bernard is the CEO there, and his whole team are just so devoted to what they're doing, and they're managing to institutionalize what perhaps started, I think, years and years and years ago as a kind of solely mission-based. How do we help people? And what they've been able to do is combine kind of business professionalism and, more of an institutional approach to providing more housing and providing more resident services and being able to help people succeed. Because, of course, housing is more than just a box. It's very much, how do people live? How are they going to find jobs? How are they going to take care of their children? So all of those things are kind of the purview of AHC. And as a board member, I get to sit in the cheap seats and really enjoy watching an amazing team do a great job.
Yeah, I do a lot of work with resident services. So I do also like a quarterly Zoom call. I call it it's almost like a therapy session. It's like a self-help group so Susan Davidson is part of that, if you know her.
Oh, yeah.
She's the head of resident services there, I think. Anyway, so now you are the CEO of AFIRE, right?
Yes.
Tell us about AFIRE and what do you do as a CEO there?
Well, AFIRE it's a bit of a alphabet soup, but it really just means Association of Foreign Investors in Real Estate. And it was created about 37 years ago by a group of Dutch and Japanese investors, institutional investors like pension plans, that we're trying to figure out how to deal with this odd market called the United States, how to deal with everything from tax and regulatory issues to how to deal with just the strangeness, the differences in terms of country to country, how we deal with this asset class. And they started gathering and over the years developed to right now, I think it's 24 different countries with just under 180 right now member firms, half of them from countries around the world, and then the other half investment managers and accountants and lawyers and brokers here in the United States. So really met as a networking group where we're able to figure out how does it work. We just published the 4th edition, for example, of the AFIRE Guide to U.S. Real Estate, which is being used as a textbook in a handful of universities. But more importantly, it's being used by those investors sitting in Japan or sitting in Israel or anywhere else trying to figure out, okay, how do we manage the weirdness, if you will? Oh, the way brokers work in the U.S. is different from the way they work in my home country. Oh, the way you set up these contracts is slightly different. The way you do underwriting is slightly different. Let's understand that so that we make fewer stupid mistakes and can focus on the smart mistakes as we try to transact and try to invest in the difficulty of crossing a border. It is significant. But what's interesting is that it's being used as a text not just for international investors, but really for students and graduate students as they're trying to understand this is the real estate market. So we're very excited that the fourth edition came out at the beginning of last year and continues to do well on Amazon and wherever digital books are sold.
Maybe we'll give it away as a sweepstakes.
There you go. I'm sure people will do anything for that, So.
Yeah.
Certainly I will. I want a copy.
I'll put you on the spot here. Like, what is the, I mean, we're hearing about all this stuff, tariffs and political stuff. Like, how do you predict, we can cut this out if it's too controversial. How do you predict this changing people's foreign investments into the U.S.?
Well, the old Saul prediction is very difficult, especially around the future. I think there's a lot of concern, certainly. And to a great extent, it's a lot of the concern comes from the fact that we don't know yet in terms of how this is going to play out. Inside the mind of the administration is always difficult, but it's certainly even more difficult now. So how much do these tariffs actually occur? How much of this is posturing? How much of this is negotiating? We still don't know. That being said, one way to look at this is that the reason to invest in U.S. real estate remains. In an environment where you have inflationary pressures like tariffs, where you have geopolitical instability, the U.S. real estate market continues, even if it's not as great as it could be, is better than everyone else. And I think that's part of the thinking. And in an environment where the U.S. dollar is as strong as it is, you would like to have hard assets in U.S. dollars. So you've got both negative and positive pressures for international investing in the U.S. real estate. There are questions about what happens from a regulatory perspective, although that's less of a concern now than perhaps it has been, years and years and years ago. I mean, FIRPTA has been diminished. There's some other things that were getting in the way. But those things are always there. It's always the concern, especially when you have a new government. But you have both positive and negative. Now, last year, and this is, I think, my greatest concern, even before we were talking about potential tariffs, the entire real estate market was very low in terms of transactions last year. And typically, non-U.S. money accounts for, depending on who's counting, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total capital that's washing around in U.S. real estate in terms of new transactions. Last year, it was closer to 5%. And that's on an already lower basis. So I think part of what was happening, there's no end of enthusiasm amongst the international investors that I speak to about U.S. real estate, but they couldn't find the transactions they wanted. Now, part of that is the same thing that U.S. investors are dealing with or have been dealing with, is that the transactions didn't occur that we thought would. The distress, it's there. The valuations are lower, especially in office. And yet we've been able to extend that. We've been able to negotiate further. So people have been waiting. There is a belief that this will be an interesting year, that you will see more of those kind of, okay, I give up. I'm going to take the hit. I'm going to sell this asset so that I can move on. But the banks really haven't let that happen. So the debt holders have been saying, no, don't give me the keys. We'll figure this out. But I think the banks themselves are getting to a point where they're saying, no, we kind of have to clear this out. That's a supposition, though. I mean, we could see another year like 24. That's always a possibility. Or this could be a very slow-moving train even through 2025. A lot of people think of recoveries in real estate as being relatively fast because the last few recoveries have been fast. In other words, it took a year or two. But if you look at the early 90s, that took more like 4 years. So when people were saying stay alive till 25, they mostly said that because it rhymes and it sounded like stay alive till 95, which is what we said back in the day. But we said that in 1990, 1991, where you had 4 or 5 years for this stuff to work itself through. So again, it's dangerous to predict anything at this point because there's so many moving parts. And we've only added moving parts with the last 3 weeks of the administration. But the desire for real estate in the U.S. continues to be strong. the power of the U.S. dollar continues to be compelling as a way to kind of even out your basket, as an international institutional investor. The market itself, how it works, how deep it is, how institutional it is, continues to be attractive. I mean, when you look at most countries, you have one, maybe two global cities per country. In the United States, you have 10 to 12 that really are kind of global institutional markets that are deep enough for there to be large transactions. If you are crossing borders, you're not going to be making a bet on a $5 million or a $10 million deal. You need larger transactions or else it's just not worth the effort. So, how many markets are like that? And again, you're going to see markets like that, one, maybe two per country in most countries. Maybe
Has there
China,
been
you
new
have a few
markets
more.
in the U.S. that have become attractive to foreign investors, like Dallas or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, traditionally, and every time we ask the question, New York floats to the top of the list. Everyone is very, very much attracted to New York. And if you look at the way that the Class A office market in New York is almost fully recovered, there continues to be a lot of attraction there. I think, and you're also seeing the job numbers in New York and in all the boroughs continuing to climb. And I think that's also a good indicator for investors. But yeah, Dallas is very attractive and has been in the top 5 or 10 consistently year over year. There are markets that suddenly will get hot and then everyone goes there and suddenly they can't do anything, like, I guess, Austin, which was a pretty shallow market to begin with, but a strong market, strong job growth if you were there at the right time, the right place. I think the Sunbelt continues to be attractive to not just U.S. investors, but to global investors. They see the job growth. They see the population growth in those areas. I think there's some headwinds, though, and we haven't really see it play out. Everything from the insurance question in those areas that are most heavily threatened by issues around climate, and the fact that we've overbuilt in the most dangerous areas that you could find from an insurance standpoint, whether it's, southern Florida along the shore or right in the middle of a forest that burns periodically in the West. And, even if you don't believe in climate change, the fact that we've built so much there means that the losses are so much greater than they were in the past. So we've got a lot to work with, and the insurance companies are saying, I don't want to be a part of it anymore, or I'm going to charge you a lot more. And so it changes the calculus in terms of how attractive these markets might be, not just for the investor, but for the people who are moving there. Suddenly, instead of the Sunbelt being a cheap alternative to being, in the Great Lakes or something like that, it's now more at the same price as being somewhere like Chicago or something like that. The weather's better, but, not always. So I think there are some counter currents that I don't think are going to stop the investment thesis in terms of the Sunbelt anytime soon. But I think you've added some breakage to it. I think people are starting to say, whoa, wait a minute, let me think through this. Let me make sure I understand what my exposure is from a disaster standpoint, what my exposure is in terms of insurance. And as you know, insurance prices every year, but we're investing for 7 to 10. So, what you think is going to happen in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, you really don't know. And the insurance companies have certainly proven this to us over the last 4 years. So I think those things are shifting. But again, the amount of people that say, oh yeah, we're all in on Sunbelt, a lot of residential, a lot of logistics, those tend to be the areas that people right now favor the most. But you're also seeing people are saying, well, it might be time for me to think seriously about office again. Traditionally, a global investor is thinking office, partially because of the scale. And I think that's a big part of it, partially because that's the sexiest real estate, or has been traditionally. And up until, say, 15, 20 years ago, residential in the United States was not really considered an institutional asset class by international investors. They didn't understand it. It looked different than in their home countries. That has changed, obviously. And I think multifamily, even starting, I'd say about 10 years ago, became really the favorite asset class that people were moving a lot of their future investments into. So the portion of their portfolios that are office are much less actually than they were 10 years ago, which was good given the problems, the challenges that office has had across the board.
I love all those thoughts. And, if we could just take a moment and kind of go back in time to little Gunnar, I would love to know, what did you want to be when you grew up? What did you study? And how did you get to where you are right now?
Oh, boy, it's pretty circuitous. Yes, from the beginning, really, from when I was pretty young, I was most interested in in storytelling, in how we understand narrative. And as such, I think my ambition always was to be a writer, to be a producer of stories, to be, to some extent, a performer. I started working in radio when I was still in high school because I grew up in Alaska, and we didn't have a lot there back in the 70s. I think we had 3 television channels, but we didn't have much to entertain us. But I do remember radio was a big part of living out there. And always kind of dreamed of, growing up and going into the, radio theater business, which apparently stopped happening in around 1955. So I was a little late to that party. And then I thought
NPR.
Yeah, NPR is fantastic. And then, there was also part of me that said, gee, what I really want is to be part of pirate radio off the coast of England. Oh, that was over by the time I was in college. So, I basically missed all the cool radio stuff. But I was lucky enough to be able to work in radio for a couple of years and to really kind of get into that and understand that. But I was also very interested in production. I actually ended up going to an art school instead of a regular college. It was University of North Carolina School of the Arts, and really focused on performance, on theater, on Shakespeare and everything else, and tried to make a career for myself for the next 5 years after I graduated. Worked a lot. Didn't make a lot of money. And when I wanted to grow up, I ended up getting a job in a real estate firm, and worked from there. But, part of what I found interesting, I went back there, I think it was probably about, I don't know, maybe 15 years after I finished. And I remember sitting there visiting with a few professors that were still there from the day that I taught, or that I was a student there. And a parent was waiting for his young daughter to come out from having an interview. I guess she was interested in going to school there. And he was panicked, which obviously as a parent, he's like, oh my God, going to an art school, they're wearing tights all the time and, doing whatever they're doing. And, I said, well, I wouldn't worry too much. And he introduced himself, and he was working for a real estate firm in the Southeast. And so was I. And we started up this conversation. And I said, well, just remember, I'm a graduate. And at that point, he felt much more comfortable about his daughter going there. So what we were learning there, although certainly we were wearing tights and talking about Shakespeare, was how to communicate and how to tell a story, how to shift people's perspectives, and how to use all the tools at your disposal, whether it's the way you appear, the way you sound, the way you construct a story, in order to get people to understand it, to feel it, and to respond to it. I use those skills every single day. And not just when I was starting out in real estate, but even now as a leader, certainly as someone who has a board of directors, someone who is engaged with the members and trying to work with it. It's always a question of, all right, how do we understand what's happening? How do we share a story? How do we understand why people are behaving the way they're behaving, and maybe work with that, however we work with that? One of the things that's interesting about actor work is that you can't control the other actors. And, you can always tell an amateur actor, because they start trying to tell the other actor in a scene, no, I need you to do this in order to make it work for me. And you can't do that. It doesn't work. What you have to do is be very aware of what you're being given, whatever that is. And if someone is in a certain place and they're behaving in a particular way, or they're trying to do something, or they're getting in your way, or they're doing something that, drives you bananas, how do you understand that? How do you work with that? How do you work with yourself so that instead of being triggered by someone, you're able to maybe understand and go from there? So all those skills that we were studying at a very granular level, so that you could go on and say, "I, my liege," for a Shakespearean play or something, very helpful when it comes to how you navigate corporate culture, how you navigate the sales process, how you navigate marketing, how you understand how the story at the end of the day is what we're always left with. The story defines just about everything we do. How do you make that story honest? How do you make that story truthful? How do you make that story enrich all of us as we go forward? That's challenging.
You're obviously great at it. You were the CEO of NAREIM before AFIRE. Like, how does one become like the head CEO of these big real estate organizations? Like, it's not like Those are two really big ones.
Yeah, tell us the story.
Well, okay. Heck if I know. I mean, it's one of those things that happens, and careers often do that. So I worked at GE Capital in the 90s, and it was a debt provider at that point before everything crashed and burned. It was a fantastic organization, global, some amazing people. And I learned most of what I've learned in real estate during that 8 years there. But after I left there, and after I left a chief marketing officer role at Heller Financial, and then GE bought it out from me, so I couldn't get away. But I ended up working as a consultant for 8 years, helping firms innovate, change their marketing and sales process, really kind of think about how you introduce a new product, a new process, how you get people to kind of buy into a new idea and understand it. So that was a fascinating job, but, and had wonderful clients, a lot of them in the real estate business, because that's what I knew, including Jones Lang LaSalle and a few private equity shops and everything else, as they were trying to figure out how to move from here to there. And one of my kind of pickup clients at that point, I was writing some thought pieces for them, was NAREIM. And their CEO, who was fantastic, but he wasn't really, focused on the writing, and he wanted someone to help out with that. So I did. And then suddenly he disappeared. And I was trying, someone hired him, and he got another more important job. And the next call I got was from their chair at the time saying, "Gee, you've worked with us a little bit. What should we be looking for?" After an hour or two of trying to figure out what, possibly they might want to look for, I hung up the phone and said, "Oh, wait a minute. That might be interesting." And I basically reached out again to him and said, "Why don't you put my hat in the ring for that? I know it's a little odd. I've never done this sort of thing before, but I'd be interested. And I think it would line up with a lot of things that I know how to do." And somehow they were foolish enough to agree with me, and I ended up in the job at NAREIM. Now, NAREIM, it was a very small operation in terms of, and within, I think, a month or so, the one other employee quit to go work for the former CEO of NAREIM, which, again, it was a great job for her and everything else, and it made total sense. But I was kind of inventing it as I went along. And it was a group that, it's very hard to keep an association together. It's non-for-profit. It's all around the membership and making sure that people value what they get out of it. And it's not just the money, it's the time. You're going to have to fly somewhere, sit down with a bunch of colleagues, have an experience together. And if you're really only 2 bad meetings away from losing them all. So, no pressure, but how do you make for a valuable and impactful conversation and dialogue where all your members have a chance to kind of engage and come away with something different? So it's not just, "Oh, I had fun, I drank too much, I went to a conference," whatever, but get to the point where people go back to their offices and say, "Wait a minute, let's bring in a few people here. I want to rethink this one thing that I picked up at that meeting." That, to me, is the goal every time I do a meeting, is how do I get that to happen? And, I don't always hit it. It depends on the people that are in the room and everything else, but it is the goal at the end of the day. How do we get people to think differently? How do we get them out of, we tend to put blinders on the real estate business. It tends to be endless conversations about exit cap rates and everything else, instead of kind of looking at, why is this product here? What is the unique value proposition that building has? What is it that the tenants are asking you to do and they're not telling you? What is it in their behaviors that's telling you how you could do better? Really looking at it as a marketing question, a psychological question, as much as a question of, how do I get the alpha? You get alpha by doing all that other stuff. And so I've tried to inject that in all the conversations and the people that I bring in and everything else in terms of where we go. And NAREIM is fantastic. It's still a great organization. It's just focused on investment managers, mostly in North America, and really is meant as a kind of a think tank environment where a lot of people come together a couple of times a year to have those kinds of conversations. About 8 years or so.
Not as good as they were, though.
Oh, you're too kind. No, I frankly, I think the woman that picked up my job after me, Zoe Hughes, who is now the head of PRIA, amazing go-getter, has left the organization, NAREIM, as good, if not better than how she found it. Really great. And I think she's going to do great work at PRIA as well. Now, part of what people don't realize is that all of us in association land and real estate, we all talk to each other all the time. because those are our colleagues, and we get information from each other, even though we're competing for your attention, we're competing for your attendance, for your membership dollars.
Same thing with recruiters too. We do a lot of that too. They think we're all it's all a racket. No, I'm kidding.
Gunnar,
You look very comfortable. You get your tie there. You might want to loosen it up a little bit. Take off your jacket because you just entered the hot seat.
Oh no!
Oh!
You can handle it.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah, have you ever done like improv training?
Yeah, a little.
Oh, this is going to be worse than that.
So we start you off easy. Do you have a book or podcast recommendation?
Book or podcast recommendation? Well, I just finished the last Murakami novel that was beautiful, and now I can't think of the title at the moment. It's something about a city wall, which it's always a surreal experience.
Who was the author?
Murakami, Japanese author, really beautiful, and really kind of one of the things I like about him as an author. He's kind of picked up the mantle of magic realism that Gabriel Garcia Marquez was kind of the godfather of, and taken it into a new context, a kind of Japanese context. He's a marvelous writer. But
the city and its uncertain walls, is that it?
Thank you. The city and its uncertain walls. And, basically it's the city and my uncertain neurons at this point, as I'm getting older. But it's interesting to me that the built environment is often a major player in his books and in his stories. And the cities. And now these are cities that I don't know. I mean, like small towns in Japan or some neighborhood in Tokyo or everything else, but he brings it together in a very kind of international mindset and how it all kind of comes together. And it's quite beautiful. And certainly the uncertain walls, it's really all about place and all about the built environment and the environment in our heads about how we interact with cities. So I do find that fascinating. I have been reading a lot more of Jane Jacobs' later works. Everyone obviously is familiar with The Death and Life of American Cities, which is obviously a Bible for anyone that's into city planning and urban design. But her later works, I think, were fascinating economic and philosophical treatises. So that's been a real kind of paradise for me in terms of new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. So I have to bow towards Toronto, even though she's passed away at all times, and the great Jane Jacobs, and what she has brought in terms of her thinking. So I've been recommending that to a lot of people lately.
We usually ask real estate professionals what their most memorable deal has been. I guess, what's your most memorable kind of project that you've been part of? The 4th edition, the AFIRE handbook?
No, I wouldn't say that was the most memorable project I've ever been engaged with. Gosh, that's an excellent question. I feel indeed like I'm in the hot seat right now.
Yeah, you're hot. Take that jacket off.
I'm hot. I don't have an answer for you. I don't quite know.
We can come back to it. If you want.
All right, let's see if we have another intense one for you.
Okay.
This one might be easier. So in your various roles, I'm sure you've done a lot of hiring. A lot of the people that listen to the podcast are getting into the real estate industry.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any specific things that you've asked or looked for when you were hiring?
Well, I don't know if I'm common this way, but I always look for people who are doing something other than what they originally planned. I find that a lot of times what you're looking for in a team is people that are willing to go beyond what they were taught to do. And I'm always interested in people that maybe have had to switch careers or switch their thinking at some point, even if it happened, in college or graduate school. But I'm always looking for that kind of someone who's lived in more than one world. Because I find those people tend to be the most creative thinkers. They also tend to be people that are most comfortable with uncertainty. Not that you're ever really comfortable with it, but who can manage it. So I find that to be where you can get some breakthrough teamwork. When people are not too attached to their own mastery and their own brilliance. obviously you want people to be sharp, you want them to be intelligent, you want them to be well versed in the subject matter. But at the end of the day, what you really want is everyone who has beginner's mind, which is one of the hardest things to get to, where you're able to say to each other, well, gosh, I haven't seen anything precisely like this before. I don't know what I'm doing. Here are some thoughts where we can go with this. What do you think? If you can get a team to do that, then I think you're able to overcome so much, and you're able to maybe, to a certain extent, for a lot of people, I think just hitting the mark is okay. Just, checking the box is okay. But I do think, especially in an environment like the one we're in right now, where everything's changing so much, you really have to overperform in some form or fashion. And you have to do it in a way where you don't drive yourself crazy. So I do find that people that are not quite as monomaniacal about their own careers or about what they do are remarkably helpful. I'll never forget having a marketing team where one of our stellar marketers was a trained CPA, and she switched, and she was thinking to her, she was able to think contextually in a way that, some of the traditional marketers really couldn't, because she was thinking systems. And what a lot of people understand about marketing, they look at the kind of the media side and the whatever you do with advertising and make something look good and whatever else. And that's part of it. But a lot of what it is understanding systems and how people en masse respond to things. And weirdly, a CPA is pretty good at that if they're willing to get beyond what their original tasks were. So that taught me pretty early on, oh, okay, I should keep looking for people like that, because they're going to do things that will surprise me, surprise themselves, and frankly, give us enough fuel to get up in the morning and keep coming to work.
My favorite people are former CPAs. Lisa Flicker is a former CPA.
I didn't pay him to say that, Chris.
Well, I knew I liked you. No, I think, and part of it is we're different people. When we're 19, 20 years old and we start down a certain path, I think everyone's a different person when they're in their 30s or their 40s or beyond. And I think we need to respect that and honor it to a certain extent when we're thinking about building organizations and bringing people in. At the end of the day, it's always about the person. I disagree with The Godfather. It's not business. It's personal. It always is. And if you have a better grip on who the people are and how you're interacting with each other, and you're able to respect each other and give each other room, again, you can mandate performance. You can continue to, crack the whip or whatever else, but I'm intrinsically lazy. I don't want to do that. There's more and more energy. Instead, how do I get everyone as motivated as possible, give them the tools they need, the guardrails, perhaps, so that when we screw up, we don't screw up too badly, the ability to be able to admit when things didn't go right and to be able to learn from that, which is really painful and difficult, and it's painful for all of us. But for us to acknowledge that and be able to work with that and move forward. I think there's a tendency, it's kind of a naive view of how you lead organizations when you think you can exert control over everyone and everything. I think the more you try to exert control, the more energy you have to put into it every single day. It's why at the end of the day, dictatorships fail, because it takes more and more energy to keep people afraid, to keep people under your thumb. I think, let's see, there are thousands, if not millions and millions of people that are following someone that never exerted control over individuals. And that would be Jesus Christ. Okay? He was not a king. He was not a dictator. And yet, do we really remember the kings and dictators of his day, other than having a part to play in the story that everyone tells every Easter? That at the end of the day, the power of someone who is not imposing their will, but is sharing their vision, is so much stronger than anyone who tries to exert control.
And he was a storyteller.
And he was a storyteller. It is incredible. Now, I'm not comparing myself in any way to, giants of our history and whatever else. But I do think the lessons and that people learn, whether it's from someone like him or someone like, I don't know, Gandhi has certainly had a big impact, well beyond any individual king, that how we tell stories and how we respect the people around us, and how we help people thrive makes all the difference in the world. Even if you're an evil capitalist, you don't have to be some sort of spiritual, superhero in order to take these lessons and put them to work. That really, it's not about control. It's about inspiration. It's about supporting others. It's about getting there as a group and letting your own crazy ego rest from time to time. And don't get me wrong, I have an ego too. We all do. That's how you end up where you do sometimes. But, it's certainly not the part of myself that I'm most proud of.
Now, you mentioned about you coming up in your career. And who have been the biggest influences and or mentors that you want to give a shout out to? Sure, there's many. So you seem like a guy.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It's like, it's Thursday. Who's helping me learn something now?
It's Friday.
It's Friday. Yeah, it's Friday. See, there you go. You just taught me it's Friday.
There you go.
I lost track. So, I think one of my first mentors that really made a huge difference once I started in real estate and really got me down, I think, an interesting path, was a fellow by the name of Peter Dubner, that you may find the name familiar because his brother has a podcast that's awesome and a series of books, Freakonomics and all that.
Oh, yeah.
But Peter was his, responsible older brother, worked at GE and was my boss. And he had such an open mind, and he was always the person that everyone would get excited about doing something, and we'd all be like piling on top of each other saying, oh, well, let's do this, and this will be a big success, and we'd prove how successful it would be in a PowerPoint pitch, and everyone go, yeah. And then he'd lean back and he'd ask that one question that would make us rethink everything. He used to annoy the heck out of people, because he would ask another question and another question and another question and look at things from multiple perspectives. And that habit of his, which, he has to this day, was so valuable. And I can't say that I've mastered it at all, but I respect it and have found that since working for him, I'm always looking for people who are willing to do that are willing to, okay, I know you're excited, Gunnar, but have you thought about this? Have you looked at that? That's meant so much to me over the years. And the people that have done that for me have been fantastic. I had a chair early on when I was at NAREIM, a fellow by the name of Jeff Barclay, who was working at Goldman Sachs at the time.
I know. Yeah.
Unfortunately, passed away a few years ago. But I remember we had this really great year. We'd really kind of hit all the marks on things, and we'd published some amazing stuff, and the meetings were good. And he walked into my office at one point, and he said, well, yeah, this is good, but look at all the things you're missing. Hated him for it. I mean, I was so angry, and I was like, what? I mean, let me have a victory lap here. And he started me down a road that helped me kind of think about not just what we were doing, but why we were doing it, and how I could shape the way I interacted with the board, the way I could interact with the membership in ways that I hadn't even thought of before. And up to that point, I think I was thinking, how much can we perform? Can we outperform? Can I make this happen? And can I do a magic trick that'll make you think this is awesome and whatever else it is? And I was really thinking like someone who was directing a really cheesy play at the end of the day. And he pushed me hard to think about things in a different way. And it meant a lot of rethink for me, and a lot of time of feeling really uncomfortable and working with people that I really didn't want to work with in terms of how we could shift the way we were thinking, the way we were talking. But it worked, and I learned so much. And after spending a lot of time thinking to myself, this jerk, how much longer do I have to have him as a chair before someone else who likes me comes in? And by the time, all of this kind of was put into place, at one point I called him up and I said, thank you. You really changed the way I think about this, and you really helped me take a new step forward. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to be the guy that does that or the gal that does that to someone. It's not easy to be on the receiving end of that. And he did it, to his credit. He was not coming at me being a jerk. He was just saying, here's what you're missing. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to do. And allowed me to learn from it. That was fantastic. And I'm so glad I had a chance to thank him, frankly, before he passed away, because he really did mean a lot to me.
Well, he probably hears this as well. Now you mentioned a podcast, I believe. Do you have your own podcast, right? Tell us about it.
Well, we started the AFIRE Podcast. I figured let's get rid of any cute names. Just it's the AFIRE Podcast. Make it as easy as possible to find.
Do you say we're going to fire away?
And I don't.
You can't.
That sounds sounds a lot like AM Top 40 to me. What you're doing there, but Z93 exclusive radar weather forecast. That was
there he
I
is.
used to
Never
yeah.
like riding a bike. Like riding a bike.
Riding a bike. It comes right back to you. So it was during COVID and the lockdown, and obviously we couldn't do meetings. And, it was the very definition of a mass spreader event to bring 200 or 300 people together from all over the world and put them in a ballroom for a day and a half, breathing all the same air. So it was one of many efforts to keep our membership together and to keep the communication going. And we did what everyone else did. We did webinars, we did meetings, we tried to publish some new things. But one of the things that came out of that was the podcast. And please don't listen to the first few. They really suck. We did them. Gosh, I mean, they're still up there. I should take them down. But
my first few are gone. My first few are gone.
I love the first few.
Oh my gosh.
It should be like before and
My
after.
first one was like 2 hours long.
Oh, ouch. Yeah. Okay. Well, mine, I have no idea what we talked about. And that whole, I'll never forget the first day that I was on the air as a radio disc jockey. And I'd been trained on everything. I'd been practicing in my head how cool I was going to sound and the things I was going to say. And the engineers had set everything up and had taught me how to do everything. And the music was coming to a close. And I switched on the microphone as, the Eagles were fading out or whatever. And nothing. Not a sound. I couldn't come up with a word. And then finally, and it felt to me like it had been an hour of silence, I switched to the next song. That was my first experience,
There you go.
Going cold on a mic. But what I found in the first few podcast interviews when I was learning how to I interview people on stage all the time. But the difference when I was podcasting was to get us to the point very, very quickly of really thinking about it the same way I imagine that interviewers on all the television shows that are interviews. How do you get there quickly? How do you get them comfortable? And how do you go beyond whatever prepared questions you have? And it took a while for me to get comfortable enough to be able to say, all right, I have some directions I want to go. And I have some, and sometimes interview subjects want to have questions at a time, and I give them some questions. But I'm not really focused on that. I'm focused on listening to what they're saying. And the closer I can listen to what they're saying, the more I'll know exactly what to ask them, because that's what happens in real life. But it took me a while to get there. And we've had a couple hundred episodes, and, I'm finally starting to get it. But it's been a wonderful ride. And, the podcast we've been able to interview, I'd say about 80% of them are members, but we also bring in people that are friends of AFIRE that are speakers. We've had a few New York Times bestsellers. It's been fantastic to get their views. And I'm not going for the long form. 40 minutes is usually 30 to 40 minutes is what I focus in on. And a lot of them are, basically whatever their subject matter is. I'm looking for anyone that's thinking counter to conventional wisdom. So everyone's very good at talking about what everyone knows. And it's what we do at conferences a lot. We prove to each other that I know my subject. What I'm trying to do is get people to tell me what most people disagree with. What is the risk? What is the opportunity that people are missing? How do we get to that point where people are thinking, I've been thinking about this. I don't know yet, but have you ever noticed how A, B, and C? If people can get to that, then you've got an interesting podcast. You've got a reason for people to listen. Because it went not where the interviewer thought it was going to go, but it followed where that person was. And so for me, podcast, and we went to video a year or so ago. That's changed everything. Apparently people like watching old guys talk as opposed to listening.
Yeah. People like, that's what we're in video now too. It's like, we never did it. And people are like, oh yeah, people like, that's how they watch the video. That's how they like
boosted
podcasting.
Our numbers like crazy. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just like crazy going from audio to video. But all that being said, it's nice to be able to have those kinds of conversations on a regular basis and to document them in a way. Because part of what's fun about being part of a network like an association, which is a very nebulous sort of thing. I sometimes feel like I'm still consulting. I just have a lot of clients on retainer, is you get to hear what they're thinking and what they're worried about and what they're excited about. And it gives you, I think, it's an amazing license I'm given to hear all of them, because I'm not a threat. I'm not going to do a deal. I don't have I have a very, very small retirement portfolio. I'm not a threat. And
Welcome
so
to our world, Gunnar. This is what we do.
This is what you do. And you hear a lot. And I find it fascinating. And I can't think of a more interesting subject than real estate. This is 87% of our lives are spent indoors. This is the largest asset class that's investable in the world. This is most of the conversations between husband and wife are about real estate. Most of what we think about is where we live, how we get to work, where we go, all these questions that come back to real estate. I think it's probably the most interesting subject matter that no one has heard about outside of our industry.
I think, Gunnar, that you are the most interesting subject matter. That
no,
not
at all.
man. I want to hear more. I want to hear more about I want to hear more about Gunnar in that acting school. What was going through his mind? I want to hear more about the radio stuff. Gunnar, thank you for coming on the podcast. You've been a great guest. You obviously, you're a great storyteller. I could listen to you for more and more for a lot more time. So thanks for coming on, man.
My absolute pleasure.
One day.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Resume, a Jackson Lucas podcast where we take a deep dive into the career journeys of some of the top minds in real estate and equip you with the knowledge to move forward in your path towards the success you've envisioned. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Beyond the Resume. We're grateful for your support. All episodes of Beyond the Resume are brought to you by Jackson Lucas, building inclusive and diverse businesses through talent acquisition. Visit us at jacksonlucas.com.